Hello and welcome to my video. I'm Sean Meanders, and today I'll be presenting an observation I made. Recently, I've been learning Mandarin in traditional Chinese, and I've been thinking a lot about the process of learning a language. And there is one complication with learning this language that I'm constantly coming back to and which is bothering me. It's neither tones nor the complexity of some characters. It's actually something more subtle, which I haven't heard anyone discuss before. Intuitively, we might think that when learning vocabulary, all we need to learn is the one word and then we're done. In this case, possibly both learn how to write the character and how to pronounce the word. Overall, that would be two things to learn. Unfortunately, things might not be that straightforward. Let us sidestep into computer science to understand how I personally visualize this process, and why I think it might be more complex than it seems. Let's now discuss what I consider to be a relevant data type and one of its implementations, the dictionary implemented as a hash map. So what's a dictionary? It allows us to take a key and quickly find an associated value. Think of a real dictionary, for example. In this case, your key would be the word, and the value would be its definition. Or, if we consider a bilingual dictionary, the key would be the word in one language and the value would be the word in the translated language. This allows us to quickly search and translate between concepts. Taking a closer look, we can notice that there's a direction to it. We go purely from key to value. But what if we wanted to go the other way around instead, from value to key? Well, if we went through this dictionary as is, we would need to go through each key one by one until we found the right value. For a dictionary with n associations, in the worst case scenario, this would mean going through all n associations. And on average, we wouldn't be much better. We would need to go through about half of them. And in our case, we don't only want to go from key to value. We actually want to go from value to key as well. We want a bidirectional association. But how do we solve this conundrum? In most cases, people simply implement a second dictionary that goes from value to key. This means that in order to keep the time complexity down, we need to increase the space complexity, in this case having two dictionaries instead of one. As a disclaimer, this is only used to demonstrate the cost associated with directionality. The analogy actually does break down when dealing with the complexity we'll be adding later on. In my experience, this added cost also hold when learning languages. It's common for me to hear a word and know I've learned it before, but not remember what it means. Then, I go through potential meanings until I hopefully remember it. Sometimes, it's the other way around. I'm looking for a word with a specific meaning, knowing I've learned it before, and have to go through potential words to find the right one. This is inefficient, and it prevents fluency. Thus, when we want to associate a word with its meaning, we actually need to learn, or memorize, two different things. However, in our particular case, we have three different aspects we want to associate with each other: meaning, pronunciation, and character. Let's refer to the individual directional associations as translations. So in total, this makes for 6 translations, and thus 6 different things we have to learn for each individual word added to our vocabulary. Thus, it's kind of lucky we don't have 4 different aspects to associate, since that would be a total of 12 translations per word, or even 5 aspects for a total of 20 translations. Although, I can actually think of a few candidates for such aspects, such as sign language or braille. Here, we have an example with a specific word. Note that the meaning is symbolic since, when learning a new language, it's preferable to avoid translating between 2 languages. Let's take a closer look at those translations. In my opinion, there are 3 categories of translations that arise naturally. First, comprehension. Those are the translations that allow one to understand communication in a language, whether it be reading or understanding what someone is saying. The next category would be expression. Those are the translations that allow one to express themselves in a language, either through writing or speaking. Finally, there are those I would call the internal translations. Those allow one to transcribe what someone says or read out loud something that is written, but without needing to actually understand the content. So, if you've learned an Occidental language before, the comprehension and expression categories shouldn't be too surprising to you. Language classes tend to have specific tests to practice them separately after all, and thus, we often think of those as distinct. It's also not rare for someone to state they understand a language without actually being able to communicate in it. For comprehension, those tests would be oral and written comprehension. For expression, it would be oral presentations and written compositions. For the other translations, though, you might be left a tad perplexed. That's because Occidental languages tend to have some rules governing those associations. Rules to figure out how to pronounce a written word, and how to write a word based on its pronunciation, although those rules are far from perfect. Thus, instead of having to learn these associations for every word, you would instead learn these rules and use them as guidance. However, while these translations are absent when learning vocabulary, they're still present conceptually. What more? There are sometimes tests to evaluate those translations. Those would be diction practices and dictations. Though in contrast, those tend to be more about learning the rules themselves than about learning the individual vocabulary. For instance, people will often use a dictionary to assist themselves during dictations, ensuring they have the correct spelling. So while it would be possible to learn the translation at each step, the translations are reinforced by a set of rules that, in this case, makes individual learning obsolete. Unfortunately, such rules don't seem to be present for Mandarin and traditional Chinese, at least in my experience. This means learning needs to be done at the grain of the word. Yet, there does exist a different set of translations that can be reinforced. This would be the associations between meaning and character. Those can indeed be reinforced by the use of radicals. These are a set of characters used to form more complex characters, each having a meaning that is imbued into those complex characters. This means it's possible to surmise the meaning of a character based purely on its composition, at least roughly. It's also possible to more easily remember how to write a character by remembering its radical or radicals. This, however, does not truly replace the need to learn the translations on a word-by-word basis. For instance, I don't think people can easily figure out how they would write a new character from meaning alone, not even using a dictionary. But while it does not bypass the need to learn those on a word-by-word basis, it still remains a very useful tool when learning, at an extra cost. There are, after all, quite a few radicals that one needs to learn first. The astute amongst you might have noticed that, technically, we shouldn't really need all 6 translations. Instead, what we really need is a cycle going through each of those nodes. Thus, we could go by with only 4 or even 3 translations, which is significantly less of them. Unfortunately, that would require our associations to be bidirectional, or one-to-one, which is not actually the case with this language. With synonyms, homonyms, and homographs, the associations are not one-to-one anymore, preventing a proper cycle. Let's take a look at a few examples. First, there are homonyms, pronounced the same way, but written with different characters. Here, we have the term
星星
which can be written with different characters, having different meanings. Thus, since we can't associate meaning and character to the pronunciation, we need to associate them directly with each other, in both directions. Then, there are homographs, words with distinct meaning written with the same character, but sometimes pronounced differently. For example, we have this character, which can be pronounced as either
月
or as.
的
Because of this, we can't actually associate meaning and pronunciation through the character. We need to associate them directly with each other, in both directions. Finally, since synonyms are a thing, we also cannot associate the character and the pronunciation through the meaning. And thus, we see that each translation is necessary, and so one would need to learn all 6 translations for each new word. As an aside, I will acknowledge that while creating an ambiguous cycle with less arrows would lead to an imperfect result, it would still mean a smaller search space and thus have some utility. However, since this would limit fluency, this is, in my opinion, undesirable. A few extra points I would like to make. First, I realize that characters aren't always the grain of a word. It's fairly common to have a word made of 2 characters after all. However, I don't think this nuance invalidates the points made here about the complexity. Next, differentiate the meaning of homonyms or homographs is often purely contextual. Mandarin and Chinese are usually, after all, considered to be a contextual language. Finally, I know the analogy with a dictionary does not hold perfectly. In this case, we could have gone for a dictionary going from character to tuple of pronunciation and meaning, for example. In fact, that's exactly how language dictionaries tend to work. However, the point of the analogy was not to state that we double the memory at each step, but that there is an additional cost to this extra association, which still holds here. Moreover, it's unclear to me how the brain actually takes this. Technically, the phonetics, through pinyin or juyin, are also a part of this. However, While they might be reminiscent to writing in Occidental languages, they tend to be more straightforward. And while they're heavily used for typing nowadays, they're mostly meant to be associated directly with pronunciation. Thus, adding them wouldn't necessarily have been relevant and would have just made things more confusing. In conclusion, after realizing that learning vocabulary means learning different associations, in this case 6, I definitely find the task more daunting. However, it also comes with a better appreciation of the process, along with a few extra insights. It's now clearer to me why understanding a language often comes separately from being able to express oneself. I also better understand why sometimes I'm able to read something out loud for others, and yet retain nothing at all of what I just said in terms of meaning, even in my native language. It's also clearer to me why a lot of people decide not to learn how to write or read in Chinese, whereas it is not something I've encountered as often with Occidental languages. Learning how to write the characters is already challenging, but having to make extra associations like this with each word, that makes it all the more complex. Do note that I'm hopeful that these new insights might help me in the process of learning the language. I already have a few ideas of how I might want to supplement my learning accordingly. Thanks for listening to me. I hope you found this interesting and maybe got some insights of your own. Take care.